Hey everybody, how you guys doing? Good. We are kicking off a new series this weekend we're calling Searching for Happiness. And really we're excited about this series because we believe it's one of those things that really resonates with all of us, because each and every one in this room this morning wants this to be true in your life. We want our lives to be happy lives. It's why we try to do the things we do and seek some of the things that we seek after. And the reality is, as we gather, that there's some of us that are actually in this room that find themselves in a season where they're incredibly happy. Like for whatever reason, things have been going your way and you're just in a really, really good place. But when we gather, we also know that there are people here in this room together that that's not their experience, that this is not true of them, that they have been in a season, maybe it's a short season or an extended season, where they've really struggled to find happiness in their life. And in those moments, it's incredibly difficult to think that could ever be possible for ourselves, for you again. And what we find is when it comes to happiness, whether you're in a season of happiness or you find yourself longing for happiness, really is the realization that happiness is incredibly fleeting. We might have it for a little bit, and then for unknown reasons it goes away and it comes back, and we can't really always define what brings happiness and what erodes away happiness. And so we're constantly finding ourselves longing and searching after happiness. And we do it in all sorts of different ways. Well, one of the primary ways that we try to seek and find happiness in our life, and we think brings about happiness in our life, is really money. And there's a lot of people who think if I just had enough money, then I would really have happiness in my life. But the reality is, and what research tells us, is that's actually not true. A few years ago, the Gallup Association did a worldwide study where they looked at the correlation between happiness and the amount of money that a person had. And what they found is really that there was no significant correlation between the two, that more money did not necessarily make you any happier. And so then we think to ourselves, okay, well, maybe it's not money. Maybe money is not what brings about our happiness. Maybe what really brings about happiness is the things that money can buy. That if we have some of those things, then we can essentially buy the things that would make us happy. And what we find, and I think this is true of all of us with different things in our life, is that we will buy something and that thing might provide happiness, momentarily happiness, but the truth is, as a few weeks, days, a couple months go by, we find that happiness begins to wane and we begin to look for happiness in other things. And partly the reason why this happens is because we tell ourselves that happiness comes from what we have. It comes from stuff. And if we have the right stuff, then we will be able to experience happiness in our life. But we know that not to be true. Because as we look all throughout history, we see the same pursuit again and again by different people pursuing wealth and pursuing things, and yet at the end of life, often it leads them longing for more. This morning, we're going to look at a story out of the Old Testament. The Old Testament is the book that tells us about the life and the history of the people of Israel. And in the Old Testament, we're going to talk about a king named Solomon. And Solomon was an incredible king. Being a king gave him not only power, but extraordinary wealth. Like Solomon had enough money to buy happiness, if it was possible to buy happiness. This is what we read beginning in 1 Kings in chapter 10. This is what we read. The weight of the gold that Solomon received yearly was 666 talents. Now, this really doesn't mean anything to us because we don't measure in talents. But if you were to convert this into some measurement standards that we have today, what we read here is that Solomon had roughly 25 tons of gold. Like he had a lot of gold at his disposal. And if you convert that over to the average price of gold in the world today, what Solomon has here is $1.1 trillion. Like Solomon is rich, like really rich. Like rich, whatever you want to buy, kind of rich. But the thing is, even though Solomon has all of this gold, that's not where his wealth ends. Because this number, these 666 talents, they don't include some of the other pieces of his wealth. And that's what we read in the next verse. It does not include the revenues from merchants and traders and from all the Arabian kings and the governors of the territories. Like, it doesn't include all of this other revenue. Now, the thing is, we don't really know how much that revenue is. But at this point, does it really matter? Like, the point here is that Solomon, there's no limitations for him. There's nothing that is preventing him from going after and getting what he wants. And what Solomon does is he does the same thing that so many of us do. We think, okay, I can now use this money to go out and to buy, make, create the things that will lead to my happiness. And so Solomon does that. This is what we read in the next verse. Then the king, Solomon, made a great throne for himself, covered with ivory and overlaid with fine gold. Now, what's important for us to understand here is Solomon isn't the first king to ever think of a throne. Like, this isn't a new deal for Solomon. Solomon already has a throne. Like, his father has passed down the throne to him. But Solomon looks at his wealth, looks at all the resources at his disposal, and thinks, what I really need is a throne that's fitting for the kind of king that I am. And so he commissions this throne to be built, and the text tells us it is covered in ivory, which is a precious resource in the ancient world. It is overlaid with fine gold, again, another precious resource in the ancient world, just like it is today. And we're thinking, or Solomon's thinking, okay, now that I have this throne, now I can be happy. But you can probably guess that's not ultimately what happens. And maybe for a season it did. Maybe for a season the throne made Solomon happy, but he found himself longing for more. This is what we read in verse 21. All King Solomon's goblets were gold, and all the household articles in the palace of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. So Solomon begins to look at the things in his house, and he starts to think, okay, I need to start replacing these things with more extravagant things, more exquisite pieces of china and silverware and cups, these goblets. He starts replacing them with gold. Everything in his house is made of gold. And I imagine if I was a servant in that house, I would be thinking, if I could just get one thing out of the house, if I could just take one of those goblets and cash it in, I would be set for life. And here's the thing, Solomon has so much wealth that he wouldn't even realize it was gone. That's crazy to think about. None of us are in a position where we're like, hey, gold bars just walk out of our house and we don't even realize that they're gone. We would notice if gold started disappearing, but that's kind of this is the point of the whole thing. Solomon has an abundance of wealth. Now here's the thing. For his life, Solomon sought after things that he believed would make him happy. He built things that he believed would make him happy. And when it came to the end of Solomon's life, this is what he said about those pursuits. Meaningless. Meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Towards the end of his life, as Solomon sits back and he reflects on his life, as he thinks about the highs and the lows that come with just the human condition, as he thinks about the things that he pursued, he thinks about the things that he was able to make or acquire, he thinks about the things he believed would bring him happiness. When it all comes to an end, what he says is it's all meaningless. That everything he pursued, all of the wealth, it was meaningless. It never brought Solomon happiness. And here's what I want you to understand. And I think this is so important. If you've zoned me out up to this point, please just pay attention to this next point, because I think this next point will help put you on the pathway towards finding sustained happiness in your life. This is why Solomon got to the end of his life and never experienced the happiness he sought over. Here it is. It's because happiness is more about who than what. Happiness is more about who, the people we have around us, the relationships that we have, than it is about what. And maybe you hear me say that and you're thinking, well, you just don't know what my thing is. Maybe you're thinking your thing, whatever it is that you're searching after, you're seeking, that you're trying to get, maybe you're convinced that's the thing that will bring about happiness. For all of us, we do search after things. We think, well, maybe this car will bring happiness, or this vacation home, or this retirement, these things in our life that if we can work hard, save up the money to go out and buy, we think, well, these are the things that will bring about happiness. But what we know, because again, we've all experienced it in some level, is they do not sustain happiness. Personally, my love language is gifts. I like to go get things, receive things. I think at times in my life, I really believe that these things would make me happy, only to find myself again and again realizing they don't. The things that we buy, the what in our life, never brings about happiness. It's always the who. And here's just a few examples. Just come with me on this. How many people know what this is? How many people own an Instapot? Okay? The Instapot was going to change everyone's life. Like the promise of the Instapot was, man, you could take like a rack of ribs and you can throw it in the Instapot, and like 14 seconds later, you have a beautifully cooked rack of ribs that tastes as good as ribs cooked on a smoker for 10 hours, only the realization is it doesn't. We think this is going to change how we cook, how we prepare, how we think about providing food for our families, and I promise you, it won't bring the long-term happiness that you're seeking after, because I know this product. You guys remember the crock pot? When my wife and I got married, we got a crock pot, because that's like what everyone's supposed to register for. In our marriage, we have never cooked anything that is at all redeemable in this thing. Like, I don't even know how people could find happiness in a crock pot, but the reality is they do. Like, this was the product where people are like, okay, the crock pot is going to bring happiness. Now, you Instapotters out there, you're like, yeah, but the Instapot is way better than a crock pot, because like, again, it doesn't take all day, but you have to remember that the promise was different. See, the beauty of the crock pot is you could get up in the morning and put some items in this crock pot and turn it on and go to work all day, not having to worry about cooking, and you could come home and your meal would be ready, you would serve it, and the family, everyone would be happy. Until something else came out, right? Now to the guys in the room, maybe you're like, okay, I don't really care about the Instapot or the crock pot. Maybe this will ring a bell. You guys remember these? These were game changers. Like before them, you had like the CRT TVs that were like 36 inches and weighed like 1,400 pounds, and like all of your friends would have to pick it up and put it on like, you know, your entertainment center. But when the projection TVs came out, total difference. We could go as big as we wanted. It was going to be amazing. We could watch football all day, every day. Like this was the perfect thing to watch the Seahawks lose a football game. Like it was like a dream come true. The Mariners to lose a baseball game. Everyone's like, yeah. Anyways, this was going to be it, right? Like this changed everything. How many of you guys had a projection TV? A handful of people. Now let me go out on a limb here. My guess is that if you still have a projection TV, this does not bring you happiness. You're like, oh, but babe, like, they got like the OLED TVs now and like all this new like quantum dot technology. Like I need something new because again, things don't sustain happiness. Maybe if you got kids at home, this might ring a bell. Anybody know what this is? It's a Hatchimal. My youngest daughter, she so badly wanted a Hatchimal. This thing, you open it up and you pet it and you hold it, and over time, literally, it hatches. And from inside of it comes this chick, and then you can like train and raise up the chick. Like she was convinced, like this was all that mattered in life. And like for months, all we heard about, Hatchimal, I want a Hatchimal. And she got it for Christmas, and she cared for the Hatchimal, and it hatched. And literally for like the last 11 months, I have no idea where it's at. Like. She never talks about the Hatchimal. Like, it doesn't sustain happiness. Okay, last one. Okay, I don't know who this lady is, and I don't know what kind of car this is, but here's the point. All of us, at some point, got our first car. The first car that we had was our pathway to independence, to freedom, to happiness. No longer do we have to rely on our parents to take us to the movies, to go out with friends. This was going to change everything in life. Now, how many of you still drive the first car that you got? No one. Because if you did, you wouldn't be happy about it. Like, you wouldn't. You'd be miserable. And here's the thing, all of it, let's bring it right back. It's because of this. Happiness is more about who than what. And I've been reminded about this fact again and again and again in my life. A handful of years ago, I had the opportunity to go on a mission trip to Indonesia. And I didn't really know a lot about what I was going to fully expect and experience on this trip. What I did know is that there was a couple of families, about 6 Christians who lived on an island, and everyone else on that island were followers of Islam. And so I was kind of going into that expecting this vision of what this trip would be like. When I got there, what I was surprised to see is really how poor people were in Indonesia. I mean, like, there wasn't a lot of cars. People would ride bikes, and you'd try to get as many people and as many things as you can get on the bikes because that was the mode of transportation that you had. We had the privilege of staying in a village with a family, and as I walked in this family's house, like, they didn't have a door. Families didn't have doors. Like, the families that had a little bit of means would have a curtain that would go over the front door of their house. There was no running water. There was no consistent electricity. That first night, when it came time to go to bed, the bed was the tile floor. Like, no memory foam, no cooling gels, no inner spring mattresses. Like, sleep on the floor. That was what your expectation and experience would be. I remember the next morning, we got up, and it was the first morning we were able to kind of interact and have some experience with the kids there. And the kids, very similar. They didn't have a lot of toys. There's no iPads, no phones. What they did have is they had a soccer ball. Like, the village had a soccer ball. And every day, that soccer ball would make its way out to the playing field. And when I say playing field, you don't think some of these nice turf fields that we have at our high schools around here. Like, I'm talking like a big, defined open space filled with dirt. Like, that was their field. And when the ball made its way out to the field, first 10, and then 20, and then 30, and then by the time all was said and done, a couple hundred kids made their way out to this soccer field, and they invited us to play soccer with them. And here's the thing, like I don't really know how to play soccer a ton. I played it a little bit as a kid. Like, the team I was with, we weren't soccer players, but it wouldn't really have mattered because these kids were crazy good. Like, they did things with soccer balls I didn't even know were, like, humanly possible. And so, in really quick order, they're just embarrassing us. They are just destroying us. And as I'm watching them just run circles around me, I'm looking at these kids, and I'm seeing them smile. I'm seeing the joy on their face, and I realize that they are so incredibly happy. And it didn't compute. Because, again, they had nothing. They had nothing that you and I would associate with happiness, but you couldn't hide the happiness from their faces. And what I realized is they were happy because they had each other. Because the people around them became the source of happiness in their life. See, real happiness is always the byproduct of who. It's the result of people and relationships. And you know in your life, if your relationships are broken, happiness isn't possible. If you've been in a season fighting with your spouse, it's going to be really tough to be happy. If you're constantly going at it with your kids and you guys aren't getting along, if you're fighting with your kids, you're not going to be able to experience a lot of happiness in your life. If you're single, and your relationships have fractured, if your friendships have kind of fallen away, happiness will feel like a distant memory. Because happiness is a part of our relationship that we experience with others. But here's what I want us to understand as well. That happiness isn't just the byproduct of relationships with others. Our happiness is also the result of our relationship with God and the views that we have of ourselves. And happy people are really the people that find harmony, that find peace in all 3 of those relationships. They're at peace with God, they're at peace with others, and they're at peace with themselves. In the New Testament, a religious leader comes up and he challenges Jesus. He asks Jesus a question, and I want us to talk about this because I really believe what Jesus says, Jesus' answer to this question really is the key and the path for all of us to find sustained happiness in our lives. And the question here, if you've been around Lake Sawyer for any period of time, you would have heard us talk about it. We really think this is an important piece of Jesus' teaching. And if you're here for the first time this morning, this is a great place for you to start. This is the question that someone asked Jesus. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? For the Jewish people, there were 613 commandments. Each of these commandments related to the other. All of them were in place for a purpose. And what this religious leader wants to know is, Jesus, what is it that you think is the most important commandment? Which is a difficult question for anyone to answer. How do you take 613 commandments, laws, and boil it down into one? Now, maybe the word that you get caught up on is this word commandment. And you're thinking, Mike, you said what Jesus' answer would literally help unlock the key to happiness. And maybe it's hard for you to connect happiness with commandments. But listen to Jesus' response, because you'll see a little more clearly what he's getting at. Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. Jesus answers this religious leader, and he says the most important commandment is to love the Lord. The most important thing for anyone to understand and live out is love for God. You see, love is the commandment, which doesn't seem all that commanding, does it? Love is actually incredibly relational. See, this is the first step to happiness. That you would be at peace with God. That you would love God. And then what Jesus does next is he kind of cheats a little bit. Remember, the question was, what is the most important commandment? Jesus answers that, but he kind of gives a second commandment. It's more like commandment like 1B. It's not really a standalone thing. It's kind of attached on to the first. It would be impossible to live out the second without the first commandment of love the Lord. But this is what he says. The second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. See, this is that whole piece of loving others. That we are called, that we are encouraged, that we are challenged to love our neighbors. But there's another truth that is embedded in this verse. Did you catch it? Love your neighbor as yourself. See, there's an understanding that a person would love themselves. That it's not just about being at peace with God. It's not just about being at peace with your neighbors. But that real happiness happens when we unlock this last piece. When there is harmony in our relationship with ourselves. And every single happy person that you come across not only understands this, but lives this out in their life. And the reality here is it's not easy. Like this is not an easy thing to do. It's not easy to be at peace with God and to be at peace with others and to be at peace within ourselves. It is impossible really to do on your own power. But that's kind of the point. See, the Christian faith, it teaches that in the beginning that humanity had a choice. That Adam and Eve, they were in the Garden of Eden with God, and God provided for them this incredible, beautiful space for them to live and to flourish and to enjoy this life. But Adam and Eve chose their own way. Adam and Eve chose their own desires over God, and from that moment forward, there was a brokenness in all of relationships. There was a brokenness in their relationship with God. There was a brokenness in their relationship with one another. And in that moment, we see the introduction of shame, and there's a brokenness in their view of themselves. And see, each and every one of us, we live we live with the ramifications of that choice. That decision, it didn't just impact humanity then, but that decision impacts all of humanity moving forward. That the brokenness that we have in our relationships with others, that the brokenness we experience within ourselves, the brokenness we have in our connection with God is the byproduct of Adam and Eve's choice. And that's why really, even when we can define the who piece, it is so difficult in our own power to find sustained happiness in life. But what I want you to understand is that I believe with all my heart that the first and most important key to relational happiness is a connection with God. And here's the cool thing about the Christian faith is that we believe that Jesus actually provided for all of us the pathway back to God. That Jesus gives us the way back home. That even though humanity was fractured and broken, even though relationships were shattered, that through Jesus, because of what he did on the cross, that when we say yes to Jesus, we place our lives and our hope and our trust in him, that he has given us access back to God. That he has, because of his sacrifice, helped restore the most fundamental relationship we have. That through Jesus, there's hope for all of us to experience sustained happiness in our lives. But we have to embrace that. And the reality is, for so many of us, we have actually just chosen a lesser version. We have chosen to live out a life that pales in comparison to the kind of life that Jesus wanted for each and every one of us. And just like Adam and Eve, we have substituted pleasure for fulfillment. We have substituted things for people. We have substituted images for intimacy. We have substituted experience for exclusivity. We've substituted the immediate for the ultimate. And we have substituted self-expression for self-control. Time and time again, we choose the lesser version of what God wanted for all of us. But in Jesus, there is the pathway back to God, the pathway back to restoration. And if you're here this morning, and if you've never explored what that would look like, if you've never explored what it would look like to be back in a relationship, to be at peace with God, what I would tell you is doing so would be one of the best decisions that you could ever make. It's what I experienced in my life. I've shared this before, but I didn't grow up in a Christian household. It wasn't part of my upbringing. And it wasn't until high school that I began to understand and experience the truth and the reality of what Jesus can do to change someone's life forever. And so when I stand up here, I'm standing up here telling you that he can do the same thing for you. And the reality is it's not just me, but I really believe that there's dozens of other people in this room who would share the same truth because they've experienced it in their own life. That God is your pathway to life and to happiness. And maybe that sounds a little weird. Maybe you've never kind of put those two things together. Maybe you don't think, okay, God and happiness go together. Maybe you actually were raised thinking, well, God and happiness are actually two separate ideas. And I get it, because like that was part of my thing. Like I thought like God was there to get in the way of my happiness. Like God was always in my life associated with the things that like I shouldn't do. Like, hey, God doesn't want you to do that, which was funny because like I said, we didn't really grow up in a Christian household. So God was tied to the absence of happiness. So maybe you're here this morning, you're wrestling, well, like how do these two go together? But what I would say is that was actually a lie. And what I've come to realize, what so many other people have come to realize, is that God is actually the source of happiness. That to find God is to find your pathway to happiness. To resist God is literally resisting the key to unlocking the thing in your life that you spend countless resources time and energy trying to pursue. Jesus will make you happy, not now, but for all eternity. And that's great news. And that's really life-changing news. And I want to talk all about how Jesus changes your everything. I want to talk about how Jesus will make you better at life. And I will next week. So as we wrap up, let me just remind you that happiness really comes from nothing that we can obtain and buy and purchase in this world. Happiness is not about a what. It's never been about a what. It has always been about a who. We have peace with God. We'd have peace with one another, and that we'd have peace within ourselves. Let's pray. God, I thank you so much for the time that we have together this morning. And I thank you for the story of King Solomon. Really, it's a story that so many of us can relate to because so many of us pursue the same things. We pursue wealth, we pursue possessions, and yet in Solomon is this incredible reminder that all of that doesn't lead to happiness. It actually leads to nothingness. It's all meaningless. So God, I pray that we would learn from Solomon, that we wouldn't repeat the same mistakes, but that we would see what Solomon came to realize in his life, and we would pivot our lives to pursue not what, but who. And God, first and foremost, that would be you, that we would have a restored relationship through your son, Jesus, and that we would begin to see that impact all of the other important relationships of our lives, the relationships we have with one another, but also the view that we have of ourselves. We thank you for your word. We thank you for this time that we have together. And it's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.